Hello, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane, your AccuQuilt expert, here to teach you how to make a triangle and a square quilt block. If you want to make an easy quilt block just like this one, follow along with this awesome tutorial. This tutorial for a triangle and a square quilt block uses AccuQuilt to cut out your fabric pieces. But I do have another tutorial up which you can check out right here using traditional cutting methods and rulers to cut out your triangle pieces. To make a triangle and a square quilt block, you're definitely going to want some AccuQuilt dies to cut out your pieces. I will personally be using this Go Cube Mix and Match companion set for the angles. I really love the Go Cube sets. That's no secret around here. And I am going to be using the Angles companion set, dies number 13 and 14. And I'm using 10-inch, but you can follow along with whatever size you have. Before I dive in, if you are new to AccuQuilt, I want to invite you to check out some of the AccuQuilt basics I have here on YouTube or over on my website, homemadeemilyjane.com. I share posts with everything you need to know about AccuQuilt, everything from deciding which machine is best for you, to figuring out which dies will work for you, to lots of tutorials and quilt block tips just like this one. So be sure to check out my AccuQuilt tutorials playlist here on YouTube and visit the link in the description below for the AccuQuilt section on my website. It is a treasure trove of information and inspiration for you. As I shared, I'll be using the 10-inch Angles companion cube, but if you don't have that one, any of the Angles companions will work for you. So the 10-inch cube will make a 5-inch block. So it'll just be half of whatever the size is of the cube. So if you're using a 4-inch cube, it'll make a 2-inch block. If you're using the 8-inch cube, it'll make a 4-inch block, or the 12-inch cube makes a 6-inch block. And all of the ones in between as well. I'm gonna link the AccuQuilt Angles companion cubes in the description below for you so you can check those out. I am working on collecting all of them so that I have all of the different sizes. But if you're looking for my personal favorites, I share all of my absolute favorite dies over on this video, and I will link them below. I'll share a little secret. My absolute favorite dies are actually the 8-inch cube and the 12-inch cube. So if you needed to start your collection, that's a great place to start. Alternatively, AccuQuilt does make 2 dies that are standalone dies for Tri-Rec quilt blocks. So you can make either a 3-inch finished or a 4-inch finished Tri-Rec block using the dies that AccuQuilt offers, and that die will have both shapes that we're using on one die instead of on 2 separate dies. Alright friends, let's dive into how to make a triangle and a square quilt block. A triangle and a square quilt block, also known as a Tri-Rec block, is a very unique shape. It is a perfect triangle inside of a perfect square. And it is not an equilateral triangle, it's actually isosceles, which means that the sides of the triangle are the same length, but the base is not the same length as the sides. It's actually just a smidge shorter. So that's how you can tell if it is upright or on a side. If it's on its side, it will look wonky. You can see here, this is upright and this is sideways. They are not perfectly equal. If you have never made a Tri-Rec block or a half a rectangle triangle, you will notice that the seam allowance looks a little funny. So as you're sewing, if you notice your seam allowance doesn't look like it should, like if you were doing a half square triangle, that's a good thing. These seam allowances will look a little off, and you can see here how it is just a little funky, and that's totally okay. Once you have your dies picked out and the fabric that you're going to use, the next step is to prep your quilting cotton. I personally prep my fabric with Best Press every time I use AccuQuilt. You can check out how I do it right here. For pretty much any quilt project, especially ones that I'm using AccuQuilt for, I make sure to prep my fabrics before I start cutting. So what I do is I grab Best Press in a spray bottle, a nice hot iron, and the fabrics that I'll be using. I like to spray Best Press to keep it from stretching. It helps stabilize the fabric. And then of course a nice iron gets all the wrinkles out before you start cutting. So for this project, I'm gonna go ahead and flatten out my fabric. These are just scraps from a different project. And then spritz it with Best Press. The Best Press or other spray starch should soak into the fabric, but if it doesn't, go ahead and fold the fabric over itself and press it down. That helps it soak in. And then we'll go ahead and iron it. As you're ironing, just let the heat from the iron do the work. You can move the iron around a little bit, but don't really worry about like pressing down or ironing from side to side because that can distort the fabric. Once the best press is all dry and the wrinkles are all out of your fabric, we're ready to start cutting with our AccuQuilt fabric cutting machine. You'll see here I have my fabric picked out, my dies that I'll be using, and my cutting mat ready to go. One thing I want to point out here is the grain of fabric is super important. So you always want the selvage edge to be the base of the triangle because it doesn't have any stretch to it. You see when I pull it, there's no stretch. But then of course the bias edge is super stretchy, and the other grain can stretch a little bit when it feeds through the machine. That's less important. But what AccuQuilt officially recommends is to have the selvage edge with the base of the die with the die's label on it, so that'll feed through the machine the most accurately. However, I'm breaking the rules a little bit on this one because I want the direction of my fabric to be going across the triangle. So I'm actually going to line it up so that this grain is parallel with the die blade, and that's going to be okay but not quite perfect. So if you want the most accurate cut, you'll want to keep the selvage parallel, but since I want the direction of my fabric to work out well, I'm going to cut it this way, and I'm just going to line up the edge of my fabric with the edge of the die, and then go ahead and put my cutting mat on top and cut it. If you are cutting lots of pieces at once, like say you're cutting out a ton of triangles, just lay your fabrics on top of each other rather than folding, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's feed this through. So we'll press it down and pull it off, and you'll see we have a beautiful triangle cut out. I got a little snags there, but you'll see that triangle looks really good. And we have that. If you needed to cut out more pieces of this fabric, instead of just pulling it over and cutting, that would be a ton of waste. So what we would do is actually flip it around and line it up, so then we can conserve waste. That way the only waste would be in between the two dies. So that's known as the cut and shift method. But I'm only making one, so I can just cut out that one and save the rest of this fabric for later. Next, we're going to cut out the background triangles. You'll see that I am using a print for my background, and that's intentional. If you're using a solid that does not have a right side and a wrong side of the fabric, then you can just cut out one pass with these two shapes and it'll work out perfectly. But when we pull up our triangle next to this, you'll see this is the left-hand background. And then when we pull it up on this side, it's also the left-hand background. So what we need is actually one of these right side up and one of them wrong side up, so that we can have both sides to our triangle. So what I'm going to do for that is actually cut it out twice. So we'll arrange our die with the label facing us. We want the grain this way to be most accurate. And I'm just going to fold my fabric in half. And that way, when I cut, I'll actually cut out twice as many triangles as I need, which I could use on another block. But this way I'll have a left side triangle and a right side triangle. And actually, what I'm going to do here is do it this direction so that the selvage is parallel to the die. So you see here I actually cut out 4 triangles. 2 of them are the left side and 2 of them are the right side. But I have perfectly left and right for this triangle. So the next thing to do is actually to bring it to our sewing machine and start sewing. But while I'm here, I'll show you how I line it up. So we're going to start with sewing our right hand side onto the right side of the center triangle. But when we line it up, we want to make sure that the top tips are parallel and the bottom edges are also parallel. So using an AccuQuilt to cut these is really helpful for super precise piecing. Now all we do is sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. So now I'm at my sewing machine with my needle threaded, and using 50 weight cotton thread, and I've already stitched on a leader here. So both of my threads are actually attached to this leader, pulling the threads up and back. That keeps the machine from eating the tips of the fabric here, which is super, super helpful. Another tip for keeping your fabric on top is to use a straight stitch needle plate. My machine and many others have a needle plate that has a nice big center hole, and that's super helpful if you're doing a zigzag stitch or a decorative stitch. But if you're just doing a straight line, use the needle plate with just one small hole for the needle to go through, and that'll keep that opening nice and small so that your fabric doesn't get sucked in. So now that we have a nice sharp needle ready to go, we can go ahead and start sewing a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once I've stitched on my seam, I'm going to sew on an ender, and this will be our leader for the next seam. Then go ahead and trim off, and you'll have your perfect triangle ready to go. You'll see here that seam nice and straight and perfect. The next thing I'm going to do is press my seam open with a nice hot iron to get it nice and crisp. And then I will show you back here when we do our second side. Once your right hand side is done, we're ready to sew on the left side. You'll see it's just the same process as before, just on the opposite side. So when we come to line these up, line up the base angles, and then line up the top with the top of that side, and you're ready to start sewing. You'll see your thread goes right through right there where that angle stops. We trim our piece free, and then I'm going to go ahead and press this seam open as well with my hot iron. Before I do, I want to point out the seam allowance here. We have a 1/4 inch at the tip of seam allowance so that when we sew this block to another block, we have the nice tip of our triangle. And then on the sides here, we have a little extra seam allowance on the side than we do on the center, and that is intentional, and you'll see it's on both of these sides as well. That makes it so that when we sew along the side and the bottom, the seam allowance hits right at the point. So we have a nice perfect triangle inside of a perfect square. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make a Tri-Rec quilt block just like this one using your AccuQuilt fabric cutting machine. You'll see your block is now a perfect square to whatever size that you needed it to be. So since I used the 10-inch cube, this is a 5.5-inch square that once I sew it together to other blocks, it'll be 5 inches finished. One thing I love about using AccuQuilt is that I don't have to trim off any dog ears when using my AccuQuilt to make these blocks. They're nice and perfectly square already. Thanks so much for watching this video. I would like to invite you to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also check out homemadeemilyjane.com for lots more quilting tips, tricks, and inspiration. Happy sewing!